Hello everyone, I'm Strat Tom and welcome to Stratopedia, where I look at the history behind your favourite strategy games. And we're continuing with my 7-part series looking at all of the campaigns for Total War Rome 2. Today is something a little different from the others. Rather than a specific time period, we're going to be looking at the century-spanning Grand Campaign. So, rather than give you a detailed look at a specific campaign, I'm going to run through the main factions of the Grand Campaign, who they are, what they did, and for the vast majority of them, how they were ultimately defeated and incorporated into the ever-expanding hegemony of Rome. And that, I think, is as good a place as any to begin. With Rome. In our last video, we looked in detail at how the small city-state of Rome became the dominant power in the entire Italian peninsula. The Romans were a strange mix of Latin, Etruscan and Greek cultures that ended up becoming greater than and dominating the component parts. Rome's initial success lay in its ability to assimilate and incorporate the disparate peoples and cultures that they conquered into their own. The Romans embodied the ideal that it is always right to learn, even from one's enemies. The character and makeup of what it meant to be Roman would change over the centuries, but one thing that remained consistent was the unmatched power of the Roman legions. Eventually, far beyond the scope of this video and the setting of Total War Rome 2, the power of the Roman Empire would wane before limply collapsing into oblivion. But for now, and for today's purposes, Rome would be the unmatched masters of the Mediterranean world and beyond. The region of Etruria lay just to the north of Rome. The Etruscans were once the dominant force in Italy before the rise of Rome. Unlike the Romans, the Etruscans were far more independently minded, and the different Etruscan cities generally acted independently of each other. In my video on the Rise of the Republic campaign, I commended the campaign for showing the different Etruscan cities as being separate factions. However, by the time of the Grand Campaign, there isn't much point. At this point in time, the Etruscans were on their last legs, a shadow of a great power that had already had its day. Any Roman playthrough should begin with you putting the final nail in the Etruscan coffin in the first few turns. The Kingdom of Epirus lay on the eastern side of the Adriatic. Their most famous king, Pyrrhus, had dealt Rome a series of defeats as they tried to wrest control of the heel of the boot of Italy away from the Greek city-states that occupied it. Pyrrhus would give his greatest linguistic contribution to us via his words that if he won many more victories against the Romans, then he would be completely undone. The term Pyrrhic victory, meaning a victory that is so costly that it is akin to a defeat, was given to us by the Epirot king. Even if, in reality, he probably didn't say it. But that's not fun. The Romans would eventually cross the Adriatic, and their victories there would not be of the Pyrrhic kind. They would be devastating and complete. The Epirot League would back the wrong horse in the Third Macedonian War, and would eventually become a part of the Roman province of Macedonia. The Kingdom of Syracuse was one of the most powerful of all the Greek city-states. It controlled the eastern portion of Sicily. The Syracusan king, Hiero, would be a staunch ally of the Romans, particularly in their conflicts against Carthage. Hiero would be succeeded by his grandson, Hieronymus, after his death. Hieronymus came to power at only 15 years old and was easily swayed by his uncles and other members of the Syracusan elite. At the time of his ascension, Rome had suffered heavily at the hands of the Carthaginians, and so he was swayed into abandoning Rome and allying Syracuse with Carthage. This would prove to be a huge mistake, a mistake they would soon suffer the consequences of. Rome would be resurgent, and despite the fact that the pro-Carthaginian faction was ousted in Syracuse, the damage was done, and the Romans would not risk the idea that Syracuse might come back under the sway of Carthage. They took the city after a lengthy siege that saw them go up against the mighty defensive fortifications designed by the famous Greek scholar Archimedes. Archimedes' fortifications did not hold back the Romans forever. The famous scientist, along with many other of his countrymen, would be killed in the Roman sacking of the city. This leads us neatly to Carthage, arguably Rome's greatest enemy. The city of Carthage was the centre of a rich and powerful maritime empire based in modern-day Tunisia. Carthage was founded by a group of people known as the Phoenicians, which is why their subsequent war with the Romans are known as the Punic Wars, not the Carthaginian Wars. The legend has it that the founder was a queen named Dido. After fleeing the sack of Troy, the Trojan prince Aeneas would find himself briefly in the city of Carthage and would become the lover of Queen Dido. After abandoning Dido, the queen killed herself, but not before cursing her kin to eternal enmity against Aeneas and his kin. Aeneas, as the legend goes, would go on to Italy and form a formal alliance with the Latins, who would eventually produce the legendary founders of Rome, Romulus and Remus. A totally fictitious tale, but interesting nonetheless. In more real history, Carthage was the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean. Historians hate to say that certain events were inevitable, but with the rise of another dominant Western Mediterranean power in Italy, conflict between Rome and Carthage was as close to as inevitable as you're going to get. There were three conflicts between Rome and Carthage. The First Punic War saw Rome emerge triumphant, but it was not a total victory. They took control of the Carthaginian territory on the western half of Sicily, as well as securing the island of Sardinia. The Second Punic War is one of the most important conflicts in Roman and perhaps human history. We will go into much more detail about the Second Punic War next time, when we cover the Hannibal at the Gates campaign. For today, all you need to know is Hannibal marched his elephants over the Alps, kicked the Romans around for over a decade but never landed a killer blow, and then a young Scipio would earn the title Africanus by defeating Hannibal on Carthage's home turf. This victory would be a lot more complete. Rome would now take all of Carthage's lands outside of North Africa, now controlling all the east coast of Iberia. Not only this, but Carthage's North African vassals, such as the Numidians, now called Rome master. In short, Carthage was laid low. However, Carthage would return to its roots and begin to recover some measure of their trade networks and their wealth. Roman Senator Cato the Elder was spooked by this and started to conclude all his messages and speeches in the Senate House, no matter the topic, with "Furthermore, Carthage must be destroyed." Eventually, he would get his wish, and the Third Punic War would see Rome finish off the once mighty city. They invaded, took the city, sacked it, then burnt it down, then salted the surrounding earth so that nothing could grow there. There would be a new Roman settlement that would eventually rise there that would be called Carthage. But the Carthage of old was destroyed, and now Rome truly was an empire. As Alexander the Great lay on his deathbed, the people around him begged him to name an heir. "To whom shall your empire go?" they asked. "To the strongest," he replied. And with that, Alexander's empire shattered upon his death, with various generals carving up their own kingdoms and empires. The Grand Campaign of Rome starts just over 50 years after the death of Alexander. And at this point, his old empire is split into several Macedonian-influenced successor states, or the Diadochi. The first of these is the homeland of the great king himself, Macedonia. The Kingdom of Macedon during this time would do its best to emulate the greatness of its past, but ultimately they stumbled at the first hurdle. Macedonian kings, particularly Philip V, tried to bring the rest of Greece under Macedonian hegemony. a coalition of Greek cities, the Achaean League being the most prominent, fought against Macedon and her allies. Of course, Philip V had another threat to contend with his forebears had not. For Alexander and his ilk, Italy and the people who lived there were just another collection of backward barbarians, nothing to worry about. Philip had the fledgling Roman Empire on his western flank. During the Second Punic War, Philip would ally with Hannibal of Carthage. However, Philip could never aid his ally on Italian soil, as Rome backed the Achaean League, who kept Philip bogged down in Greece. After Carthage was defeated, Rome was in no mood to bask in the glory of victory, and instead looked immediately to punish the Macedonian king for siding with Rome's enemies. At the Battle of Cynocephaly, the Roman maniple system would prove that the time of the Macedonian phalanx as the premier battle tactic was over. Macedon was defeated, separated into smaller republics who were all now clients of Rome. Later rebellions would see these republics folded into the empire proper and form the Roman province of Macedon, to be ruled by Rome directly. Rome's Greek allies, represented in game by the Athens and Sparta factions, thanked Rome for defending them from Macedonian rule and wished them a safe journey home. They soon realised that the Romans had no intention of leaving, and they had merely swapped Macedonian rule for Roman rule. The Greeks would turn east to the Kingdom of Pontus, specifically King Mithridates. Mithridates was such a prominent figure that the upcoming wars would be known as the Mithridatic Wars. Mithridates would prove to be a fearsome foe, but his ultimate defeat would move the Roman borders east over the Hellespont into Asia Minor. This would put Rome at odds against our third successor state, the Seleucid Empire. However, by the time the Seleucid Empire enters the Roman story, they're not really the Seleucid Empire anymore, as they no longer controlled their capital at Seleucia. Initially, the Seleucid Empire had been the biggest of the Diadochi, stretching from Syria all the way across Mesopotamia. The Romans faced off against a kingdom that only really controlled Syria. What happened to the rest of it? We'll get to that. Interestingly, this Syrian kingdom, based out of Antioch, was housing a certain exile, Hannibal Barca of Carthage, the scourge of Rome. Petty jealousy and court rivalry meant that Hannibal did not get a second chance at leading armies against Rome in the field. However, when Syria was ultimately annexed, with nowhere else to run, Hannibal committed suicide. It brought an end to a man who had haunted the Roman consciousness for decades. Lastly was Ptolemaic Egypt. After the death of Alexander, the general Ptolemy had himself declared the new pharaoh, a title that Alexander himself had claimed. The Ptolemaic dynasty had a habit of, let's say, keeping it in the family. All of the descendants of Ptolemy would be named Ptolemy and would be married off to their sister, who would be named Cleopatra. The Ptolemies may have adopted Egyptian stylings and titles, but they kept to their Macedonian roots in culture, language, and warfare. Native Egyptians were kept out of positions of power, making them feel like they were ruled by foreigners, despite 14 generations of the Ptolemies. The father of Pompey Magnus had established Ptolemaic Egypt as a client state of Rome under Ptolemy XIII, choosing not to fight the seemingly unstoppable advance of the Romans into the east. His teenage son Ptolemy XIV would be the last pharaoh of the Ptolemaic dynasty. He would be overthrown by his wife/sister Cleopatra, who allied herself with Julius Caesar, producing a son for him. After Caesar's assassination, Cleopatra would align herself with his right-hand man, Mark Antony, with whom she would have twins. After the Battle of Actium saw the end of Mark Antony and the ascension of Octavian Caesar into Caesar Augustus, or Revered One, the first emperor of Rome. Cleopatra would attempt to keep her throne, but her charms would not work a third time. After realising she was destined to be paraded through the streets of Rome in shame, either to be executed or exiled afterwards, she decided to take her own life. Legend states that she induced an asp to bite her on the breast, the snake's poison granting her a swift, dignified end. Caesar Augustus would not only turn Egypt into a province, but he would make it the personal property of the emperors. Egypt was vital to the empire, as its rich and bountiful lands provided much of the grain supply needed to feed the empire, hence the reason the emperors guarded it so jealously. The Gauls were the boogeymen of the Roman world, the savages from beyond the border. Brennus and his Senones tribe had sacked Rome in 39 BC, and despite the growing power of Rome, it cast a shadow over the Roman minds. The territory of Gaul equates roughly into modern-day France and some of the Benelux region. Rome took control of the southern portion on the coast of the Mediterranean, mainly to link their Italian homeland to their Iberian possessions. We will discuss the Roman conquest of Gaul in a future episode when we look at the Caesar and Gaul campaign. But the short version is that Julius Caesar made his fortune and cemented his place as the greatest of the Romans when he conquered the Roman boogeyman and brought Gaul to heel. The Gauls were not a unified monolithic people. There were many different tribes scattered across the region who had their own culture and languages. Two of the main tribes in game are the Arverni and the Belgae. The Arverni are who the modern-day French region of Auvergne is named after, occupying roughly the same territory. They were a prominent and powerful tribe in central Gaul and are most famous for their chief Vercingetorix, a king who came the closest to unifying the Gauls and defeating the Roman invasion of their country. Ultimately he failed, but he pushed Caesar to the very edge of his breaking point. The Belgae, I'm sure it won't surprise you to learn, occupied the territory in which we find modern-day Belgium. Being on the northernmost coast, they were the furthest removed from Roman influence. The long-haired Gauls, as the Romans called them, were the tribe that Caesar considered the most savage and dangerous. On the far-flung Isle of Britannia, we find a group of tribes of the Celtic culture. Like with the Gauls, the Brits were not a unified people, but they were protected from Roman encroachment by the grace of the Channel. It was not a protective barrier forever though. Caesar would make incursions on the island, attempting a punitive campaign against the British tribes that had aided the Gauls. However, it would not be until the reign of the Emperor Claudius that Britain would be conquered and brought into the empire. Never fully Romanized, Britain was, for a while, a hotbed of rebellious activity. The Iceni Tribe, the playable British faction, were the tribe that brought us the legendary warrior queen Boadicea. Boadicea would lead a massive rebellion against Roman rule that would eventually be defeated at the Battle of Watling Street. When the Roman Empire began to collapse, Britain would be the first territory to be properly abandoned by Rome. And so we reach our penultimate section. These last two entries are unique, as they will not end with how they were conquered by Rome. Germania was at war with Rome throughout its history, but the Rhine River and the River Danube would mark the edge of the Roman world, with Germanic tribes lurking menacingly on the other side. Like with Gaul and Britannia, Germania was made up of very different independent tribes. The Germans had made a habit of raiding Gaul long before the Romans had conquered it, and they did not abandon the practice just because the Romans had moved in. Rome made multiple efforts to pacify the Germans, with mixed results. The Roman general Varus would lead his men through the Teutoburg forest after being tipped off by his trusted auxiliary commander, Arminius, about a rebellion breaking out. But there was no rebellion. Arminius was the leader of the Cherusci tribe and had united a number of other Germanic tribes in their efforts to drive the Romans away for good. They would ambush and annihilate 2 full legions in the forest. The 2 legions would never be raised again, and Rome accepted that the borders that existed were there to stay. The Roman legions in the west would swap roles from conquerors to border guards. Except, of course, for when they were all fighting each other in Rome's many civil wars. Tribal confederations from Germania, such as the Franks, Saxons, and Vandals, would be the powers that would break through the Roman borders and would not be turned back, ending Roman domination in the west. And lastly, the heirs of the Persian Empire, Parthia. Parthia started as a small kingdom on the eastern edge of the vast Seleucid Empire. But remember that thing I said we'd get back to later? Well, we're here. Parthia retook the old Persian heartlands of Babylon and Mesopotamia from the Seleucids. Rome would conquer the Seleucid land on the Mediterranean coast, and so the two empires would butt up against each other. Rome and Parthia would exchange blows with each other for the duration of both their empires. In their time, Parthia would deal some of the most major blows against Rome, defeating and killing Julius Caesar's triumvirate colleague and the richest man in Rome, Marcus Crassus. The Parthian dynasty would eventually fall and be replaced by the Sassanid dynasty, but the enmity between the two empires would continue. When not killing each other directly, the Parthians and Romans would also regularly fight proxy wars against one another whilst avoiding direct conflict. The ruler of the Kingdom of Armenia would change on the whims of which of the two powers was in ascendancy. And so, we're at the end. This has been the part where I would discuss authenticity. But it is difficult to thoroughly discuss how the game could have represented 400 years of history. But it is difficult to properly discuss how the game could have represented 400 years worth of history better. There are some things, like the Civil War mechanics, that I could discuss, but I think that would be more pertinent another time. So, until next time, don't forget to like, share and subscribe. I've been Strat Tom, and I'll see you next time.